It's wonderful to formally welcome you to what is the 5th LEAP lecture. And obviously, as you'll see, we've changed a little bit from previous years. We don't have an in-person meeting this year, and I'm sure you all know why, but it is still wonderful to welcome you. I thought I'd just provide a very brief introduction about what this is, what LEAP is. So LEAP is the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past. It's a research group that is dedicated to the study of African economic history here at Stellenbosch University, an interdisciplinary group, I should add. So it's an initiative both from the Department of Economics and the Department of History. And this year, obviously, with the changing situation, we've decided to move online. But actually, before the pandemic already, we've decided instead of just one lecture, we'll have a panel discussion. And that was because we wanted to have an interaction between the fields of history and economics, and specifically then on this topic of women and work. I'm certainly looking forward to some fascinating debates. Before I hand over to Amy, I just need to make a couple of thank yous. The first is actually to Amy, because Amy has put this together. Amy is a PhD student at Stellenbosch in the history department, and she's been wonderful in organizing all of this. And then I also have to thank firstly the institutions, so Stellenbosch University and the departments of history and economics. And so also my thanks to the Andrew Mellon Foundation, who would have also funded your flight tickets, but of course that is not happening at the moment. And then I also want to take this moment, I do this every year, but to also thank LEAP's supporters across the world. So we have many scholars that support our research and collaborate with us, trying to encourage and promote African economic history on the continent. I also have this year some supporters that provide financial support, and I'm very thankful for that. And these private individuals, and I want to specifically mention Keith Menkes, who's based in the US, who has provided wonderful support for us to help our students through these difficult times. So that is really fantastic and provides us with the means to continue the work that we want to do. That is it from me. I look forward to a very interesting discussion. And Amy, I'll leave that in your capable hands.
Great. Thank you so much, Johan. And thank you to everyone who has participated today. I think it's been great so far and really looking forward to this discussion. So I'm just going to do the bios in alphabetical order, and then I will kick off the questions. So Alice Evans lectures in international development at King's College London and has published on gender equality. She also has a forthcoming book called The Great Gender Divergence. Secondly, Emmanuel Akyeampong is a professor of history and African American studies at Harvard, as well as being the faculty director of Harvard University Center for African Studies. And he's published widely on culture and different themes in African history, and is also working on female entrepreneurs at the moment. Then Jane Humphreys, who is a professor of economic history and fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. She is an expert in labor markets, gender, the family, wages, and women's work, and she's published extensively on these topics. And one example of a recent book is Unreal Wages, Real Income and Economic Growth in England, 1260 to 1850. Then we have Joyce Burnett, who is a professor of economics and lectures at Wabash College. Her work has covered the role of women in the labor market and the gender wage gap. Her book, Work and Wages in the Industrial Revolution, ties together these and many other themes that we've raised today. Then finally, we have Ushehwedu Kufakurinani, who is the chairperson at the Department of Economic History at the University of Zimbabwe. And he has published on domesticity and white working women in Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. And he has a book called Elasticity in Domesticity, White Women in Rhodesian Zimbabwe, 1890 to 1979. So with that, I'm going to kick us off with questions. And Jane, you're up first with, what are the different approaches to women and work used by economists and historians? And what have we learned about women and work from the Industrial Revolution? I will also post this question in the comments.
Okay, first thing to notice is that there's a similarity between both disciplines in that they have generally ignored women and women's work. So it's not been a high priority topic for either economists or historians in the past. I think it's fair to say that economists now approach the topic and would approach the topic, neoclassical economists, with their own vision of human behavior, human responses in mind. So we have rational, optimizing, maximizing people with good flows making decisions. And you can illustrate this with their interpretation of something, for instance, like something we've talked about today, the development of the male breadwinner family. So for orthodox economists, this would come out of purposeful, rational behavior in response to rising male wages, so that the increase in men's wages results in women retiring from the labor force, children being allowed to not work but attend school, the domesticated wife, the school child becoming part of a respectable family life. And of course, you can see the kind of progressive implications in this. Whereas historians, I think, when they come to address issues of women and work, of course, are much more ready to accept the fact that there are structures as well as agents, and that these structures can combine to restrict activities and thwart people making these rational choices, that the world is full of unintended consequences. We can see some of those in play. And that also time matters, so that you can, in fact, interact and respond over time with agents and structures bouncing off each other, interacting. And of course, this could, again, we can illustrate this kind of sensitivity by thinking again about how the male breadwinner family structure might come about, so that we would find, for instance, that feminist historians, radical feminist historians, would see the male breadwinner family structure as coming about partly as a result of male trade unions' quest for higher wages associated with protective labor legislation, maybe misogynist trade union activities, producing, in fact, a family structure which subordinates women. On the other hand, you would find perhaps a Marxist feminist historian who would argue that the male breadwinner family structure is a way of protecting women from the double shift. It does allow for increases in well-being. It allows for women to, in fact, devote themselves to creating comfort within the home, and has been associated. When the male breadwinner family structure is associated with sufficiently high male earnings, it is associated with improvements in well-being. And of course, finally, you might get people who are interested, historians who are interested in the state, who would read the arrival of the male breadwinner family structure as reflecting the state's interest in the demographic, the physical, and the social reproduction of working class families. So I've tried to illustrate how we might see the differences between economists and economic historians in approaching issues. I could have used other examples. I could have used, for instance, attitudes to the pay gap, to the gender pay gap, explanations of the gender pay gap. It's something that, Joyce, for instance, has written about extensively. And I think there are many ways in which you could illustrate this account. Your other question, Amy, I think I've probably used my 5 minutes already, but your other...
You still have 2.
Sorry?
You still have 2.
I still have 2, okay. Well, what have we learned from the Industrial Revolution about women's work? Well, I think we've learned that we can talk about women in a dualism with men, women's work, men's work, but that, and this has come up several times today, women are not a homogeneous category. And I think this, if you work on women in the Industrial Revolution, you pretty soon see that marital status matters, whether people have children, whether they're childbearing or pregnant, what the age of the women, what the class of the woman, whether they live in an urban area or a rural area, their ethnicity, of course, matters, their race, their religion, all of this really matters. So we have to, I think, break down our category of women if we want to understand the role of women in economic change and the kinds of work women do. I think another thing that we've learned from the Industrial Revolution is that, of course, getting at uncovering women's work is particularly difficult. Joyce illustrated this with respect to the census. But, you know, there are also other sources in which women's work remains hidden, disguised, for example. And this means that we miss really quite huge events. And one of the things I've been working on recently is hand spinning. Now, spinning was the biggest manufacturing job in pre-industrial Europe, in pre-industrial England as well. It's destroyed as a whole job category in a matter of 25 years. We don't know anything about it. Nobody's written on it. Nobody'd worked on it until relatively recently. It doesn't even get much of a mention in gender histories. What we hear about is the handloom weavers, and we hear about coal miners, and we hear today about truckers, but I haven't really heard that much about, say, telephone operators, let alone the hand spinners. Why? Well, because it's women's work. And it's women who are being technologically displaced. And not only is this important because it's a huge job that disappears, but it actually creates dependency of women on men. Before wages are sufficiently high to be family wages, to enable the male breadwinner family structure to deliver improvements in living standards. So this is what I called in the paper with Sarah Horrell, the miserable route to the male breadwinner family structure, the grim route. And that dependency of women on men, that actually, you know, it's got long-standing implications. That really reaches down to today, you know, in the sense of what families are supposed to look like. When they don't look like that, how we regard them. We just had an argument in something I'm writing at the moment about whether we can call families that don't have a male breadwinner broken families. Is that pejorative? I mean, can we really call them broken families? Doesn't that already kind of carry a value connotation about what a family should be like, should look like? So I think, yeah, you know, but studying any period of economic history will give you lessons, will convey interesting points about women and gender and the relationship between gender and economic change. And I think it will also actually tell us quite a lot about gender today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. Emmanuel, you're up next. So we're zooming in a little bit. And Emmanuel, your questions are, what do we know about women and work in Africa? And why has this area of historical research received so little attention?
Thank you, Emmy. Let me start by stating the obvious, that we are referring to half the population in communities and societies, and their role in the economy clearly matters. I want to briefly provide quick overviews of what we know about women's work in Africa in the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the independent eras, and why much of this has received so little attention. In the pre-colonial era, women played central roles in agriculture, in crafts, and in trade. Esther Bosserop wrote a book now half a century ago on women's role in economic development. And she noted that where planting agriculture prevails, or in agricultural systems where they plant tubers and yams, the hoe tended to be the most important agricultural implement, and women tended to dominate in farming. This applies to the forest and the woodland areas of West Africa and Central Africa. And it has also been noted that in these areas, we have matrilineal systems, a reflection of perhaps the important economic and social role of women in these societies. It is where grain cultivation and the plow was introduced that you see men dominating in agriculture. To go to trade, European observers, to take the Gold Coast, in the very early 17th century, commented on how women walked long distances to go and trade. This phenomenon disappears with the insecurity of the transatlantic slave trade. And then it returns again, and in the 19th century, both European observers, missionaries, begin to comment on women traders. When you look at a place like West Africa or Ghana, where we have these huge open air markets, they are literally women's wells. And women are responsible for ensuring that food shows up on every single table. It is not surprising that in 2018, when the MasterCard did an index of women entrepreneurs, which was an international study, they discovered that the countries with the highest number or proportion of women entrepreneurs were actually Ghana, Uganda, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. And globally, Ghana topped in terms of the proportion of women entrepreneurs. And I've kind of provided a brief history of that. In terms of crafts, let me just give one example based on a comment that Alice made. Colin Krieger, who studied textiles in pre-colonial northern Nigeria or in the Sokoto Caliphate, noted that a fifth of 200 types of textiles, so 40 out of 200 textiles made in Sokoto, were made by women on women's looms. Then came the colonial period, and a number of developments will begin to make women's work invisible. The colonial economy was a male economy. Wage labor was defined as masculine. Indeed, colonial governments across sub-Saharan Africa discouraged women from settling in towns, defining urban space and urban work as male work. Colonial education privileged males and not women. Another important influence was the European missionary presence, and their activities also influenced perceptions of the individual, marriage, family, household work, pushing women into the domestic space instead of the public sphere. Missionary education of women was to prepare women to be wives and to be mothers, and not in crafts and artisanal skills that could have put them in the marketplace. The irony is that women's work for families was too important to be rendered invisible. So while missionaries insisted that women should not be in workplaces, they continued to work, only that their work became invisible, making it difficult for women to claim the proceeds of their labor or to have it formally accounted for. Cash crops in many West African rural economies were gendered male, and women were assigned foodstuffs or food crops farming. Women's economic production was subsumed under household production. A third point in the colonial period, and then I'll move on, is the partnership between colonial rule and chiefs and male elders in indirect rule. What it did was that it placed African chiefs and African male elders in the codification of customary law. As family law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, land tenure fell under customary law, this consolidated the subordination of women. We've seen these traits extended into the independence era, the disparity in terms of education when it comes to gender, the disparity in terms of access to the workforce, the fact that most of women's economic work takes place within the informal economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Why has this area of work received so little attention? Which is your second question. I have 2 minutes. I will be just fine. History is very much an archive-based discipline. And the archive we have in Africa is a colonial archive. The colonial government was preoccupied with the economy and with law and order. So production that contributed to colonial revenue and exports, like cash crops, mining, is accounted for. Food, stuffs, cultivation, etc., was not. When women came to towns to work, it was initially through the commercialization of chores within the household or the domestic realm, the sale of prepared foods, the taking in of laundry, the brewing of alcoholic drinks. So these were also invisible in terms of colonial accounting. It is when women showed up in colonial records, this is often when they were disorderly, such as protesting against past laws in South Africa, or shipping owners protesting against the municipal beer halls in South Africa. Then they show up in the record. The Aba Women's Riots, which has been written a lot about in southeastern Nigeria in 1929, showed that Igbo women were very invested in both the economy and in governance. We talk about how the Gold Coast by 1911 had become the world's leading producer of cocoa, but we don't hear much about women cocoa farmers who made up probably about a third of cocoa farmers in the Gold Coast. These have been blind spots, not only in research in the colonial and post-colonial period, but have had implications into the present. Let me end with one example. We are all very excited about the economic potential of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Women constitute a significant proportion of cross-border traders. In the Southern African Development Community, which is where you are, women constitute 70% of informal cross-border traders. This is known anecdotally, but how do we fashion policies to strengthen their role and their contributions? Let me end there.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Next up, we have Alice, and we're staying on the African continent with this question. Alice, how did the rise of the male breadwinner model play out in an African context?
Thank you so much. Really, this is just a footnote to everything Emmanuel said, well, focusing on Northern Rhodesia and now Zambia. So I chose to focus on Northern Rhodesia because we then have the Road Livingstone Institute. So we have anthropologies from the 1930s, 1950s, 1970s, and then I went out and I did almost 2 years of ethnographic work myself. So using archival work, interviewing people in their 70s, their 80s, and learning from them, and trying to piece together the story of social change over the past 100 years. So if I take you back 100 years ago, Bemba women in Northern Rhodesia, they were practicing shifting cultivation. So men and women were economically interdependent, and they were also matrilineal. So if a woman wanted to leave an unhappy marriage, that was quite all right. And she would be supported by her natal family because people valued wealth in labor, more hands to the field. But that changed, that radically changed with the development of the copper mines on the Northern Rhodesian copper belt. So in the copper belt, there were two major employees. That is domestic service. They wanted men. They were employers, white employers did not want women in their households because they were worried about Black African women's sexuality. So they only employed men. Also, the copper mines only recruited men. So you had this environment of economic interdependence, and then with the development of the copper mines, the two major employers favoring men. Now, men rushed to the labor market, and at first, the sex ratios kind of gave women the upper hand because men outnumbered women 3 to 1. So if a woman wasn't happy in that environment, she could shift to a better deal. So even though she was economically dependent on a man, she was not trapped in a monogamous marriage. That changed, however. the colonial authorities were worried about untrammeled urban growth. So they increasingly put prescriptions on women's independent mobility. They said you can only come to town on pursuit of a marriage certificate, for example. They made women stay in town dependent on having a marriage certificate. They clamped down on what we'd already discussed. There's a key sector of employment for women, that is brewing. They clamped down on women's brewing. So they circumscribed women's incomes. And the church was important here because they championed monogamous marriage, denying divorce to members. And so you have a couple of shifts going on. Materially, women are becoming more dependent on men. Ideologically, the church is promoting this monogamous marriage. Institutionally, the colonial authorities are binding women in marriage. And also, the emerging African elite sought to gain prestige and status by copying the white settlers with this model of the male breadwinner model. So many women withdrew from the marriage and they gained status through their husband's profession. Now, of course, there was in the Copper Belt, with rising standards of living, a degree of affluence. There were factories, there were pineapple factories in parts, and manufacturing, industrialization, and of course, the relatively good jobs in the copper mines and urban services, especially in the independents. So in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, men could kind of provide for their families single-handedly. And what this created, in a sense, was a coordination problem. Because men monopolized socially valued jobs. Men wore the blue overalls, and the copper was the lifeblood of the Zambian economy. So men gained pride and status in wearing their hard hats, going out to the mines, doing dangerous work. And they gained status, whereas women, they remained in the shanty compounds. They had a much narrower social circle. So their knowledge was more limited. They weren't seen out and about providing for their families. And what this meant is that people came to doubt women's competence because they hadn't seen. So, it means a woman, if you let her lead, she might destroy a village. So because people hadn't seen women demonstrating their equal competence, they were reluctant to give women a chance. Moreover, men gained status through being household providers. It would be embarrassing if a wife went to work in the market because it would signify his failure to live up to these normative standards of being a male breadwinner. The neighbors might think that he was failing. So we have this negative feedback loop whereby you have two things. One is someone's gender stereotypes, underestimating women, and two is our norm perceptions, our expectations about how others might perceive us. And that created this environment of championing the male breadwinner. And moreover, women were materially dependent on that. Now, this persisted as long as the price of copper was high. But that all changed in the 1970s and the 1980s on account of a number of things. One, the price of copper tumbled. Two, Zambia became heavily indebted, unable to, and it introduced structural adjustment. The IMF and the World Bank imposed structural adjustment policies, trade liberalization, economic liberalization, and this crushed many infant industries. So there was per capita incomes fell, rising male unemployment, men no longer able to support their families. Moreover, there was an introduction of health fees, user fees for education, and let's not forget the horror of HIV/AIDS. In 1999, the average life expectancy was about 39. So it came to be that families could no longer rely on a male breadwinner because of those macroeconomic shifts. And what this meant is that families now saw it as economically advantageous for women to go out into the labor market to earn money. And that's exactly what happened. Women went out into the markets. Women started fighting to provide for their children, to pay for electricity and services. And interestingly, those women whose parents, whose mothers had already worked, maybe they were slightly more egalitarian and ambitious in their own outlooks, so they pursued Ushehwedu, which is jobs that men do, like being miners, being electricians, driving the big dump trucks to the copper mines. So what we had as a result of this macroeconomic change, as a result of a shift in perceived interest, women going out into the labor force increasing. And I think going back to Joyce's point earlier, maybe women earlier had worked in the home, maybe selling things in the shanty compounds. What they're increasingly doing is going out into the markets, right? Seizing these new opportunities, not seizing new opportunities, but fighting for existing opportunities in the mines, trying to provide for their children. Now, if we read qualitative research from the 1990s and early 2000s, it's very pessimistic. I mean, and this reflects the general literature on structural adjustment and gender. They say, you know, women are increasingly working, they're doing the double shift, but with no increase in rights or recognition. It's just painstaking work. And that is exactly true, because, you know, women are just doing more without getting any. But by 2011, 2013, when I was doing my field work, you'd had widespread and prolonged exposure to women demonstrating their equal competence. So then if you go to the markets, if you go to the schools, if you hang around at the shanty compounds, what you hear over and over again is Banamayo, Putiba Bomba Inchto Shaobame, which means women, they can do what men can do. And that wasn't some NGO discourse. It didn't come about because some NGO told people to believe in gender equality. This discourse emerged because that's what people had seen with their own eyes. They'd seen widows fighting to provide for their children. They'd seen mothers paying the electricity bills. They'd seen women building their own plots, setting up their own homes, providing for their children, and especially in towns, right? So in towns, and I want to make the rural-urban contrast here, because in towns you have this heterogeneity, density, propinquity, intersecting migration channels, which increases people's exposure to different things going on. And it's not just exposure, but also association in the public sphere. People gather in these urban markets, and they come to question ideologies. They share their experiences. So it's not just the case that one person can see a woman working and then think, oh, there's gender equality, but it's a matter of this collective consciousness, like in the 1970s in England or the USA, but people breaking down these pre-existing gender ideologies and starting to champion and recognize and publicly affirm women's importance, challenging wife beating, for example. And that varied, and that was really important, because it's through seeing other people championing those discourses, seeing other people employing women, that women gain confidence in pushing back. And it's when people witness those encroachments and transgressions in the public sphere that they become more confident to follow suit, because they know that they will be widely supported by others. Whereas if we contrast other domains, where those kinds of gender changes are not publicly visible, we do not see change. So for example, care work is usually undertaken behind closed doors. So even if a man is sharing care work, it may not be seen by others. So you don't get that knock-on positive feedback loop. Likewise in the rural areas, which are much more isolated. Even if you have one man who condemns wife beating, he might be reluctant to intervene if he hears this going on with his neighbors, because he anticipates social disapproval. Or a woman, if she's growing up in that village environment and there are not many female breadwinners, she may be pessimistic and underestimate herself or not anticipate support.
Sorry,
so
I'm going to have to cut in there. Maybe you could add some comments to the chat box, but unfortunately we're going to run out of time if I don't.
Please cut me off. I want other people to talk too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Ushe, and Ushe, I'm going to hold you to 5 minutes. I'm going to cut you off, sorry, unfortunately. And Ushe has the question of, how does domestic ideology shape women's work? And does domestic ideology shape women's work? Ushe does not have his camera on, so we'll just hear his audio.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So what I'll start by doing is to first conceptualize domesticity itself, because more often than not, I think the term is very fluid, and not every time that you use it that you're on the same page with everyone. So I'll take some time, conceptualizing this term. First and foremost, it is, I believe, a historically constructed notion which has, so many layers of meaning, and this is what complicates it. And at face value, this is gender neutral, right? So if you get into a dictionary definition, domesticity is not necessarily a gendered term. And yet, of course, in feminist discourses or in discourses that discuss gender or women, we have come to use domesticity with a specific inclination. And we usually do it, with this strong gendered interest in conjunction with the life of women, And we see sometimes it is interpreted as an oppressive regime, or perhaps a potential source, or in some occasions as a potential source of liberation. But more often than not, it's actually seen as an oppressive regime associated with women's confinement to the home. And of course, it is seen as something that it conjures negative images of a physical space, such as home, images of a certain type of work associated with homekeeping, or an occupation such as a household servant, for example. So these terms or these ideas sort of sum up or conceptualize the concept of domesticity. But for me, I think the ideology itself, it takes various forms across epochs, across geography, age, race, and so forth and so forth. And it conjures up, the aspects to it that emphasized in different times. And this is very important because there is an aspect of taming, if you're going to look at the etymology of domesticity. There's also an aspect of malleability, obedience, and so forth and so forth. Now, let's take this ideology and take it into the workplace, or perhaps let's use the public-private dichotomy, if you want. If it's in the private space, domesticity will then take the form of housewifery. Pretty obvious, I guess. But when you get into the public space, the argument that I make in my work is that domesticity is elastic, hence the concept of elasticity in domesticity, where domesticity can actually take various forms and shapes, even when women move into the public space. This is why we then have what we call occupational crowding or occupational segregation. The form that it takes, is not coincidence that women are not crowding, say, in managerial posts, or crowding in traditionally male dominated spaces, that crowding in certain specific characters. That itself is telling that there is the domestic ideology at work. Women are nursing, they're becoming nurses, they're becoming teachers, they're clerks and typists. And if you look at clerical work, it is similar in terms of confinement and the manual nature of the work. It borrows a lot from the domestic space, from the home frontier, if you want. So you discover that when women move into the public space, or so-called public space, the domestic ideology shapes and informs the kind of space that they occupy and the kind of work that they occupy. So it's appearing in the nature, in what women are expected to do, the extent to which they can go in terms of hierarchy. It also affects and shapes the places and spaces that they are occupying. So the overall conclusion that I would make, in the interest of time, is that the domestic ideology is pervasive, is everywhere, and it takes various forms. It just takes our eyes to really see it at work, and it mutates over time and over space. But essentially, what it is doing is leaving women tied to domestic-oriented kind of duties. However, and this is perhaps the last statement that I want to make, we can begin to debate whether the problem really is with domesticity itself, or with how society interprets, relates to, and assesses or valorizes, or fails to valorize domesticity. And then we can begin debating from that angle. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ushe, and thanks for being on time. So our next panelist is Joyce, and for those of you who were here earlier, she's already spoken a little bit about this, but we're speaking a little bit more broadly. Her questions are: why should we care about female labor force participation? And what are the problems associated with measuring female labor force participation? Thanks, Joyce.
So first of all, why should we care about female labor force participation? I think the main reason that we care is because labor force participation is seen as a measure of whether women are able to fully participate in all aspects of human society and to develop their full potential. Often societies with low female labor force participation, that's an indicator that women's choices are constrained to a narrow range of activities, and they're not given the opportunity to do anything. And they may be constrained either by external constraints on what they're allowed to do, or by some internal constraints where they have accepted this domestic ideology about what they're supposed to do and what their role in society is. So we are interested in women being able to participate in any form of human activity that they'd like to. I think labor force participation is also important because it affects women's bargaining power within the household. In order to have some power, women need to be able to live independently of men. If they can't do that, then they can't leave a bad situation and they have very little power within the household. So I think it is important to women's lives. What are the problems of measuring labor force participation? There's both practical and conceptual problems. The practical problems are that we have poor information on the work women do. So women often do work that's informal, irregular. They're less likely to work for wages than men. Their status might be defined by their marital status rather than by their occupation. All of that means that their work is less likely to be recorded in various documents than men's work, and therefore it's harder to measure. So sometimes we have to be very clever about how we measure it. And as we heard from Amy, sometimes they'll even just refuse to tell the questioner what their work is. So practical problems are also conceptual problems. So the concept of labor force participation assumes that only work for the market matters. Production for household use doesn't matter, and that's a problem for African women's work, I'm sure. It's also a problem for measuring GDP, that we ignore an important part of productive activity. Another conceptual problem is we often think that real work is work outside the house, where often most pre-industrial work by both men and women was done in the home, and then it is harder to distinguish from home production than other work. Labor force participation also assumes that a job is a continuing relationship with an employer. People in historical labor markets, and often people in the developed world, have employment relationships that are different from, so we like in the US, I'll have an ongoing employment relationship even when I'm not actually working. And in the past, women had much more irregular relationships with work, and therefore what we think of labor force participation today doesn't match with what labor force participation was in the past. So I advocate thinking of other ways to measure what women did besides labor force participation. I think even if we measured it perfectly, it wouldn't tell us what we wanted, because the concept itself is ahistorical. So I encourage people to measure other things. All right, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Joyce, and sorry for rushing you all. I know we could all speak about these things for much longer. And I also think it takes longer to say something on Zoom than in person. It's my personal opinion on Zoom. If you have any questions for each other, I invite you to pose those now, and then I'll also invite any attendees to post their questions in the chat box.
May I ask Joyce a question? I was happy when you reminded us that in the pre-industrial period, much work was done within the household for both men and for women. And we talk in Africa about how much of women's work sort of takes place within the household. And I was wondering whether by juxtaposing these two scenarios, maybe we may gain some insights about how to account for women's work or make it more visible. So if we can draw insights from what you have to apply to the African context, because we seem to think that it is when they become formal, when they register, when they go and get a banknote, they need collateral, that these are the indices that then brings them within formality. But not many are able to make this jump to that, to collateral, to this, to that.
So if we had figured out how to measure work within the home very well in the historical period, maybe that would help, but I don't know that we figured it out very well. I think that people tend to figure this out for male work. Like if men are largely producing agricultural output that they consume, that gets somehow that gets counted and put in GNP. But things that are female work, we're like, oh, that's too hard to count it and put it in GDP. So, I mean, clearly we, in some cases, are able to figure it out and do it. And then in other cases, in the case of women's work, we tend to not. So I think it is useful. And I think there's a good comparison there with, African work as well, and the non-market work.
Then there's also a question for Alice in the questions. The question is, can you comment on the potential role of supply side factors in the changing employment opportunities for women in Zambia? In particular, the growth of the service sector in Southern Africa. For example, the growth of South African multinational retail sector.
I interpret that as demand side, right? The rising demand. But in Zambia, female employment increased because it was counter-cyclical. It was a massive period of worsening economic security. There wasn't, this wasn't a Claudia Goldin model of the USA where you have sustained economic growth and white-collar jobs and more demand for women and women responding to those new economic opportunities. Okay, so I guess it's the same point of the rising opportunity costs of women staying at home, but it wasn't that there was a growth in jobs. Far from it. Women were trying to keep their families afloat in very difficult times. Zambia this was a counter-cyclical rise in female employment, which then entrenched female labor market commitment, as we've seen in other parts of the world.
And then there's a question that I'll pose to Emmanuel. Could you expand on the point raised about the link with higher rates of female entrepreneurship? I think it's vis-a-vis and historical economic role of women, or via a historical. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe I'm reading that wrong. Specifically in Ghana, Uganda, is this a generally found observation elsewhere in other parts of the world?
There's an interesting paper that I'll find and maybe share, and you can share with, and it was written by Nathan Nunn, Alberto Alessina, and others. And it looked at women's participation in the labor force in the United States. I know, I believe Joyce said we should look at other things, but and what I found interesting was that looking at cultures of work from Africa. So for example, you would find a high participation for, let's say, Ugandan women in fields like nursing, etc., in Europe and in other places. They found high participation for West African women, for example, in the workforce. But similarly, in places where men had dominated in agriculture, in places where cereal cultivation and the plow had, and some of these places also became largely Muslim, as you know, for the Sahelian parts of West Africa and the North. Their participation in the US labor force was low. And so they were struck by these kind of historic and cultural continuities between work cultures on the continent and present day participation in the labor force by women in North America. So this then takes us out of the African context, but speaks to these interesting continuities. So I'll share that paper with you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And then Jane, you've asked if we've spoken enough about the disabling effects of pregnancy and childcare. Do you want to elaborate, or would you like to address it to a specific person?
No, I just thought that the panel may wish to pick up on this. It's something that we haven't perhaps talked enough about, particularly in both African context And in historic European context, of course, pregnancy, childbirth was fraught with dangers and very often disabling. So I wondered if people wanted to talk about that as a way of nuancing ideas about dependency and ideas about being able to contribute economically.
And to expand on that, perhaps how it might have played out differently in different family systems.
Let me make a very quick sort of observation using two Ghanaian examples. So among the Ga, these are the people of Accra, the capital. Residential patterns were gender-based. So in Ga societies or traditional Ga societies, women lived separately in their quarters and men lived separately. And one of the interesting things in the evening is to see little children crossing from women's household with baskets of food to men's households as dinner crosses almost geographically across. But what that meant is that you saw multiple generations of women living within a household, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, and it became the basis for economic activity, especially in things traditionally like the smoking and the long distance sale of fish. So a really great study was by Claire Robertson called Sharing the Same Bowl, which is a study of Ga women and these intergenerational family networks. Among the Asante, menopause was often welcomed among Asante women because Asante matrilineal families often would push women into marriage so long as they continue to bear children. And since women married early compared to men, you would see that by the age of, let's say, about 45 or 50, a woman may have been married 3 times because they were often married to very senior men and they would have children. And since in Asante we are matrilineal, we reckon children through mothers. So not that the men were not important, but they are not really important to counting how we reckon our children. When women reached menopause, they always chose not to be married again. And Jean Ullman and Victoria Tastian wrote an interesting book called We Shall Not Eat Stone. And it is almost as if on menopause, women then form networks that then foreground economic activity. And I think these are two very interesting examples about how women's sort of reproductive cycles, intergenerational relationships feed into economic activity.
Can I just observe then that that links back to something that Beatrice said in her paper this morning when she observed that in fact there were, she could see that economic activities were conducted within households where there were in fact several women. So it was a kind of a mother-daughter connection that sustained certain kinds of economic activity in early modern Stockholm. So I think that's quite an interesting link.
Do you want to come in on that, Alice?
So I think everyone here will agree that domestic work, childcare is a huge constraint upon women's labor force participation, particularly if that takes place outside the home. I'm sure we all agree that. But what I think is sometimes interesting is the way that demand for female labor can shape how the importance or the distribution of childcare. So for example, if we look at Taiwan and Japan as a comparison, just to take us to another continent. So Taiwan's economic growth was through labor-intensive, small and medium-sized enterprises. And by about the 1970s, 1980s, there was huge labor shortages of skilled labor because these SMEs could not heavily invest in training human capital, unlike the large firms in South Korea and Japan. So they heavily recruited married women. And so because of their labor shortages, because of the intense growth, because of the labor intensive growth, these SMEs increasingly became more flexible. supporting married women with children if they wanted to bring their children in on a day when their children were poorly, or to leave early in the evenings because they needed women's labor. And I think this is precisely what Claudia Goldin found in America, right? So in the 1920s, you had the marriage bans, but then as growth kicks off and there's a labor shortage, then employers become more supportive and accommodating. So I think understanding the trajectory of economic growth is really important in understanding how employers become more supportive. Whereas, by contrast, if we take South Korea and Japan, where you have in South Korea, for example, you have these very large firms. They have the money, the capital to invest in their human capital training. And like in Japan, workers tend to have a job for life. And there isn't a shortage of skilled labor. So employers don't necessarily need to attract and retain married women. So in Japan, you have these very, very long work days, which are incompatible with childcare. And employers don't need to be flexible because they've got surplus male labor. So they don't need to compromise or to become more flexible. So I just wanted to add that point about how the trajectory of economic growth can shape how employers are more or less responsive to care work, just as a little addition.
Johan's question is, when do women stop working / being classified as working in agriculture? It seems one of the most striking differences between 18th century Europe / US and the 20th African censuses is the number of women in agriculture. So Johan's question is to Jane / Joyce. So I don't know which one of you want to.
I'll go ahead and start. So I think that it's the 19th century and there's a decline in male as well as female work in agriculture. So basically you go from lots of hand techniques, you get more machinery, and you get just sort of lower total employment in agriculture, men as well as women. And, you know, it's not zero, but it shrinks very small. I guess that's what I'll say about that.
Well, this links back to Emmanuel's point about persistence studies. And of course, the plow is supposed to have played this key role. Plow agriculture is supposed to have played a key role in structuring the way in which women's work is understood and employed. I think Alwyn Houghton made the point that it's very difficult to handle a medieval plow if you're 6 months pregnant, for example. So I think, you know, that there are ways in which agricultural progress interacts with our ideas of what women could and should and were able actually to do, physically competent to do. But also, I mean, in 19th century Britain, there's powerful social norm develops against women's field work. You know, Joyce will attest to this too. So it becomes really rather inappropriate for girls and women to work in agriculture in the fields. And I think that's associated with ideas about, you know, what is morally correct, what is morally frowned upon in the society. Much less so in Europe, where you've got small-scale family farms and family activity going on in the fields. But in capitalist farms in Britain, field work for women becomes inappropriate in the 19th century.
Great. Thank you. We're going to end it there. And I think Joyce has already left to her lecture. It was a little bit nostalgic seeing students in a real class. Thank you so much to all of you, and thank you to all the attendees. Thank you once again also to the History Department at Stellenbosch University, the Economics Department at Stellenbosch University, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And once again, to all of our panelists, it's been wonderful, not enough time, but hopefully we can do this at some point in person, maybe close to the southern tip of Africa. Thank you, and have a good evening for everyone in South Africa. And everyone else a good day.